Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material. So, Mark, when you hear Colombia's conflict, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of people, it's probably this image of a chaotic, almost random drug war, right? Just raw power and brutal violence. But what we're looking at today suggests it's just the tip of the iceberg. The real story is about a hidden, strategic war of intelligence.
Exactly, Sarah. And this quote from Edward H. Whitmore's research just cuts right to the chase. He calls it a labyrinthine battle. That word is so important. It's not chaos, it's a complex, calculated conflict that's being fought in the shadows. And once you start to see it that way, it really changes your entire perspective on what was happening.
It absolutely does. And to really get to that truth, we first have to break down the popular story, which our source material here actually calls the myth of chaos.
Right. We've all seen this story play out in movies and TV shows. It's this simple narrative of good guys versus bad guys, cops versus narcos. You get this picture of just total disorganized mayhem. But what the research makes crystal clear is that this view completely misses the incredibly intricate, strategic nature of what was really going on behind the scenes.
So let's push past that myth and dive into the complex reality. Because this was never, ever just a two-sided fight. It was so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. What was actually unfolding was a four-way covert war. Of course, you had the famous cartels, but you also had the FARC guerrillas who were carving out their own territory. Then you had the brutal AUC paramilitaries who were essentially a counterinsurgency force. And of course, the state, which was often working very closely with U.S. intelligence. All four of these groups were strategic, all of them were sophisticated in their own way, and they were all playing this incredibly deadly game.
And what's fascinating is how sophisticated even a single faction could be. Look at this comparison. The Medellin cartel, Escobar's group, was all about visible, gut-wrenching terror. But the Cali cartel, they were a different beast entirely. They operated almost like a clandestine intelligence agency, focusing on bribery, surveillance, and quiet, targeted strikes. So you have two cartels, but two totally different doctrines of warfare. One is brute force, the other is all about the brain.
Exactly. And that distinction really brings us to the core argument of this whole explainer. To understand this conflict, you have to realize that the true fight wasn't just happening in the streets or the jungles. It was being fought somewhere else entirely.
So this is the big question, right? If it's not just about who has more guns, what was the real battlefield? And the answer is that the terrain wasn't just physical, it was informational. The real war was being fought over intelligence.
And the source material gives us a term for this: hybrid warfare. It's the state where all the neat categories we like to use just completely fall apart. Is it war or is it crime? Are these guys soldiers or are they criminals? In this kind of environment, intelligence isn't just some helpful add-on, it is the absolute foundation of every single move. It dictates who survives and who succeeds.
And this slide illustrates perfectly how it works. Every single side, the state, the cartels, the guerrillas, they all use this exact same cycle. First, you collect the intel, maybe from human informants or by intercepting signals. Then you analyze all that data. Third, you get that actionable intelligence to your teams on the ground. And finally, you execute a precise intelligence-led operation. This cycle was literally the engine driving the entire conflict.
Right. And this isn't just some abstract theory. The source material details actual operations, like one called Silent Convergence. In this mission, they fused U.S. satellite data with Colombian human intelligence, allowing a joint team to pinpoint the exact location where FARC guerrillas and cartel traffickers were meeting. It was a single, surgical strike that was only possible because of that fused intelligence.
But this constant intelligence war, it didn't just happen in a static environment. It created this other phenomenon, a relentless, non-stop cycle of adaptation. It was basically an arms race, where standing still meant you were going to lose.
So let's just walk through how this cycle works. It starts with something like this. The state gets a tip from an informant, they conduct a raid, and they successfully shut down a cartel smuggling route. That sounds like a victory, right? But it's never where the story ends. Exactly. The cartel doesn't just pack up and go home. They adapt, they innovate, they start building these so-called narco subs, which are almost impossible to detect, and they create new ways to encrypt their communications. They learn from every loss and they evolve.
But then the state and its partners, they adapt too. They bring in advanced sonar technology to hunt for those subs, and they pour resources into cracking the new encryption codes. Every single move is met with a countermove. It's a constant chess match.
And that's the key takeaway, right there. It creates this perpetual loop, this arms race. But it's an arms race of information and innovation. In this kind of war, it's the smartest and most adaptive player that survives, not always the one with the most brute force. This relentless cycle brings us to a really powerful and, honestly, a pretty sobering conclusion about the true nature of this kind of conflict and what it means for the future, not just in Colombia, but everywhere.
I mean, that line says it all. You can sign a peace treaty, a kingpin can be taken down, but that doesn't stop the intelligence war. The networks, the methods, the institutional knowledge, it all persists. It just morphs and finds new purposes. The conflict never really ended. It just transformed into something else.
And that's the ultimate point here. The fall of Escobar, or the FARC peace accord, those were huge events, but they didn't stop the game. It just changed the players and the rules. Colombia essentially became what the source calls a living laboratory for modern covert warfare. And the lessons learned there are incredibly relevant for understanding complex conflicts all over the world today.
So it leaves us with this final, really crucial question. If wars don't truly end anymore, if they just transform into these permanent intelligence battles, how does that force us to change our entire understanding of conflict, not just in Colombia, but everywhere? It's a huge thought to chew on. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next analysis.